listening to a bonus episode of the Futures podcast. I'm currently hosting a monthly discussion on artificial intelligence over at SingularityNet's YouTube channel as part of their decentralized OS web series. For those of you who don't know, SingularityNet is a decentralized marketplace for artificial intelligence. On this month's episode of the series called Decentralized Future, I interviewed product designer Tom Gruber, who was head of design for the team that created the Siri virtual assistant. You can watch a full video version of this discussion on SingularityNet's YouTube channel or at futurespodcast.net. Now, Tom Gruber has been pivotal to the developments of many of the innovations that have helped humans augment their intelligence in their daily lives. Most famously, he was the head of design for the company that created Siri, one of the world's most popular intelligent assistants. More broadly, he's interested in a wide range of ideas, from how machines and humans can foster collaboration to how AI enables learning, knowledge sharing, and productivity. But Tom, I want to start at the beginning and ask, what is Humanistic AI? Well, what is this idea about, and how does that differ from AI?
Yeah, good question, Luke. So if you think about what we've been seeing in the press that celebrates, the achievements of AI, we often hear the fact, oh, AI just beat humans at something. We just beat humans at chess or Go or something like that, or we just had AI that replaced human jobs. That's a kind of AI that's not collaborative. It's competitive, right? And, it's celebrating automation for automation's sake. Humanistic AI says, let's put the human in the center of this, and let's frame the role of AI as either augmenting humans, making humans better at what humans want to be good at, or collaborating with them, being a partner in some kind of intelligent task. And intelligent agents can do both of those things. So humanistic AI is basically a way of choosing what to do with your technology that will give you the kind of outcomes that you really want.
Is humanistic AI similar to the idea of intelligence augmentation?
It's very related. Augmentation is one of the strategies you would use. So humanistic AI says, let's make sure that we use AI that helps people do what people want to do. Well, one of the things like I want to do is I want to have better vision and better hearing and better memory and better cognition, and that's augmentation. So when we put on glasses, we're augmenting ourselves, but with AI, we can augment our cognitive abilities as well, and that's absolutely central to it. And it's not just AI, and really this whole idea of augmentation includes this whole notion of getting feedback about what's going on with you. And so this whole notion of quantified self is a piece of that puzzle, but also the whole feedback loop of how am I doing at this task? How alert am I? How am I doing? And the AI is actually a partner in that feedback loop. So the AI that knows you better helps you be better.
Well, it feels like one of the key things in that feedback loop is the idea of an intelligent assistant. An intelligent assistant is really what you're known for. So why is this idea of having an AI that knows us better than sometimes we know ourselves, why is this such a compelling use case?
Well, if you think about the basics, when Siri was started about 10 years ago, and at that point we had the dawn of the Web 2.0 world, where we had this enormous bounty of web services, Yelp and Google and Maps and Wikipedia, and all these things were coming online. We found that if you had 10 fingers and a keyboard and a good internet connection and plenty of time, you could, in fact, take advantage of all those services. But the moment you start carrying around a mobile device, you can't do it. You need a Jarvis, just like the guy in Iron Man needs a Jarvis to help him drive around when he's doing these crazy contraptions. So Siri was invented as a way of, say, augmenting us normal mortals who carry around tiny little screens to get all the benefits of this huge web infrastructure that was coming online. And so it was a humanistic play. Both the other technical co-founder, Adam Chyer, and I are both the big fans of a guy named Doug Engelbart. And he was like the guy who really made augmentation, technical augmentation, as the goal for computer science really well known. He also invented the mouse and collaborative computing and hypertext, among other things. So anyway, that's the idea basically. The Siri, it's an intelligent assistant, but its goal wasn't to be an assistant for its own sake. It was to make the users able to get the benefit of the technology that was out there.
Well, you're most known for your role in the design of Siri, and I just wonder what inspired the creation of this platform.
Well, we saw this potential that language was a natural interface. And so we knew that with, already where everyone's sick and tired of trying to help people muck through all the mess of web interfaces and, the typing and the clicking and all this stuff. It's already hard enough for normal people to use this stuff. But then when we went to mobile, it's even more extreme. So now we say, well, what is something that everyone can do? Well, everyone can do language. All right, so we resurrected this decades-old vision of, which we didn't invent, of an assistant, an AI assistant, as an interface. And then we said, what would it take to bring this artifact of an assistant to life so that you can use what you're born with, your natural language, to get all the benefit of your technology.
I mean, it feels like there must have been so many challenges in those early days in the process of building something like Siri when the technology was very limited. So are you able to tell us about some of those challenges and how you developed technology to overcome them?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm really proud of this little tiny startup, Siri. When Apple bought us, there were 24 people. Mm-hmm. And wow. We had created, the first mainstream AI assistant that actually did all the things we all expect them to do now. Now, 20, that's a small team. So that's one thing is like, well, it was a challenge. How do you do this? Mm-hmm. The second thing is they built it in 2 years, which is also kind of astonishing. So I'm really proud of the software engineering and the design side. So we had to overcome challenges there. Now we did it the way startups do, which is to work really hard and iterate and collaborate well. So we iterated through hundreds of designs. We tried everything a bunch of times before we got it right. We couldn't afford to have a big waterfall project and just fail. So that's one thing. The other thing is that we had to deal with the uncertainty of the technology. Now, when we started the company in early 2008, there was very little at that point viable speech recognition at scale. There was the speech recognition companies that like the kind you have in your car. You know how well that works, right? I mean, the standard was pretty low back then. So we had to say, well, we're betting the farm here that we're going to have natural language and speech, which are two different unsolved problems in the mainstream in a couple of years. And so we had to very carefully watch the technology and see where it was going. And we decided to go ahead and pull the trigger and go for speech when we saw that when you add consumer scale data as a feedback loop to the engines that learn how to do speech recognition, then they could actually cross the threshold of quality. And then we'd also bet that after a few more years, if we could in fact bring an assistant to the mainstream, we would have a feedback loop of positive returns. That is, we'd have enough data so that the speech could really get good, which you saw later. After a few years, it got much better. And that was because of the data.
And I mean, that partly was Apple, wasn't it? Bringing it to a consumer at a mass scale probably was the only way to get access to that sort of speech data. So how did Apple, after they purchased the Siri project, how did they iterate on it? And were you happy with some of the changes and the ways in which they rolled it out?
Well, remember the basic philosophy is to help people get their technology benefits, right? Well, when we were doing as a startup, we were thinking e-commerce, buying things online, ordering pizza, whatever, that sort of thing, booking hotels. When Apple bought us, what their major problem was just using the things that were already on the phone. Mm-hmm. So, calling and texting and calendaring and all these things that you already do on the phone. So we retargeted the experiences, the use cases around those problems, and they're big problems. So that was good for Apple and good for us and good for the world because now we all have a phone that's slightly bit easier to use. And the other thing was that you asked about the data. Well, of course, Apple has, presence in 36 countries and languages. It has enormous user base and so on, but it's also a very privacy protecting company. So we did have to be very careful on how do we gather data so that it would only be used for speech recognition and only be used by people who clearly opted into it and so on. And that was a bit of a challenge because other platform companies don't have the same self-imposed restriction on the use of consumer data.
I mean, everybody knows about using Siri to navigate their phone, but there's real important work that's being done here, because intelligent assistants, they can really change the lives of disabled individuals, and these changes have life-changing consequences. I just wonder if you could tell us how you've seen the rollout of intelligent assistants really transform people's lives.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I mentioned in my Humanistic AI TED Talk that one of the use cases for Siri was, in fact, for disabled people. In particular, a friend who is blind and quadriplegic, and he uses it to run his social life. He wasn't able to do that before without a caregiver. It's to have a social life versus not having a social life is a big deal. And there's a whole bunch of other cases there. For instance, there's a company I'm advising now called Cognition with an X, and they're building a kind of a high-end brain interface, actually, and a neurotech interface to enable people who can't speak to speak, but they're hooking it up to a virtual assistant so that they can not only speak, but also control their world. So open the door, turn on the lights, and so on. So again, that the assistant is a natural partner in this interface between the human and all the technology in the world.
And it feels like we're at this kind of mid-stage at the moment where we're collecting all of the speech data, that we're finding use cases out in the world for how something like Siri or other intelligent assistants can be used. But what do you think is the ultimate aim for intelligent assistants like Siri? How do they truly make us smarter?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think you said before the word augmentation. That's my philosophy, is that we're all challenged. I mean, I'm a cognitive psychologist by training, and if you read these people like Siegel and so on, they'll tell you real clearly that humans are very limited. What we know about human psychology is that we're kind of limited. We're finite. Now, AIs are very limited in their own way, and they're going to be limited forever. But what they're good at is different than what we're good at. AIs have certain skills. We have other skills. And so that combination is going to be great. Now, I popularized this idea of a collective memory or group memory, also applied to an individual, a personal memory. And a personal memory is something that an AI assistant can be really good at. Just like, hey, human assistant, what was that thing we did? What was that meeting we did? What was that movie we saw? Who's that person we met? What's their favorite, sport, whatever. Even small things like that, or even larger things like maybe you're looking, so you're saying, well, who was that character I interviewed 4 years ago that did such and such? Computers are really good at those sort of things, and and humans are really good at this, understanding the other humans. And so maybe what we can do is have assistants whose job is really to mediate these external memories, external resources, to be the interface to these other things that make us smarter. And there's a lot of more examples of that.
I mean, that idea raises a whole bunch of philosophical questions about whether we would even want AI to enhance our memory. Would we really want perfect recall? Isn't there sometimes an importance of forgetting?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. Like, there's a great Dark Mirror episode in this, of course.
There always is.
Black Mirror. If you take any of these to extreme, of course, perfect memory, if it's incorporated the wrong way into the policies and cultural norms, can be a nightmare, right? Because it would imply a lack of privacy. Now, you can, in fact, navigate memory and privacy, just like you can navigate. Think about this. We had for the longest time, we had the ability for people to be anonymous just because they were unable to be tracked by the technology. That advantage is going away. It's going to be hard to be anonymous anymore in places with sensors all over the place and centralized networks of computers. It's already gone in some places, China and so on, but it's going to be gone in other places just because of the nature of this. Well, society doesn't just sit back and go, oops, it's all over. We can renegotiate our contract with ourselves and say, well, it's okay to have memory and cameras here, but not there. It's like there's no cameras in the bedroom. There's no tapping of private phone calls or so on. You can draw these boundaries. And there's no reason why you can't do that with cognitive enhancement as well. We don't let athletes take steroids because it makes the game, it ruins the game. So we don't allow, so all of these things are rules of the game. That's an arbitrary rule. You could say, well, in my sport, you can take steroids, but then it'd be a different game. This is another variant of its technology is sort of value neutral. It's how you apply it kind of argument. But it's actually quite true in the case of AI, because we're going to see superhuman cognition coming out, and it's not going to be evenly distributed. So we're going to have to think about how to make a policy that reflects our values as a society.
I mean, this seems to be the tension, doesn't it? Because we almost want intelligent assistants to help us, and the moment they're kind of almost there, there's a little bit of clunkiness about them, and we kind of assume that because some of these intelligent voice-activated assistants are a little clunky, that AI really isn't having much of an impact on humanity. But then you look at how AI and algorithms are used to nudge certain behaviors, and suddenly you realize, oh my goodness, no, AI really is here, and it does have a massive impact. So how do we ethically design some of these tools and technologies that we have coming over the horizon?
Well, yeah, to your point there. I mean, we have what looks like sort of not so bright AI right now. Mm-hmm. We have assistants that mostly understand our language as long as it's in short bursts and so on. And we have computer vision that has a kind of a probabilistic sense of who you are. It kind of knows with some percentage that it knows who you are, that kind of thing. We have a kind of an AI that can do interesting things, but it certainly isn't, omniscient or general AI or anything like that. But lurking in plain daylight is the fact that we have absolute super intelligence in one dimension that's driven by AI. And that's the ability to control human behavior at scale. 4 billion human beings are part of a system which is being controlled at scale to get them to do what? Stay online.
Yeah.
Right? That's AI-driven stuff, right? And it's a superpower that no dictator has ever had. Nobody who's ever tried to have been as successful as the social media platforms at getting people to do things against their will, which is to stay online for hours at a time and follow themselves down these rat holes of delusion. So, okay, why did that happen? Well, it happened in an unregulated, free-for-all environment. That's not the only way we can run a society. We can say there are boundaries. So we're just beginning to start. Like, for instance, we say it's not okay to incite violence in speech. Mm-hmm. It's always been true in public speech, but it's also, we can say we don't get to do that in private speech either. So, okay, and you can regulate that. So there's a lot of things. And it's funny thing is because the AI, again, it's not that much different than other kinds of things. You could also do this with CRISPR, a bunch of other things where we say these are powerful technologies, very scary if used in the wrong hands, but we have to not let it be used the wrong way.
Well, this is the interesting thing about behavioral control and how it operates at the algorithmic scale, because what it's really doing is mechanomorphizing us. We hear the idea of anamorphizing, the idea of attributing human attributions to objects, but really what it's doing is attributing machinic attributions to what it means to be human. And there's some advantages there, I guess, because if you want to understand a human, or if an AI wants to understand a human, the best way to do that is to stop a human from being human and speaking in a quote-unquote natural way and get them to speak in a machinic way, to reduce their communication to 140 characters. That's so much easier to understand than say sarcasm. So how do we balance these current tensions? Ultimately, how do we ensure that we don't take all of the awful things about the attention economy and bring those into the future when we think about the design of AI?
Well, there's sort of, like I said, there's policy ways things, and there's also technical things you can do.
Yep.
So for one thing, is the reason why the attention economy industry has gotten so good at behavior control is because we're already digitally mediated through the clicks and words and sliding and all that stuff we do with the devices. So we already have very clear computer readable signal that we're giving them. The other side of it is the behavior that they want to optimize is easy to measure, which is stay online, keep clicking. Now, if we wanted to maybe try a little harder, we could say, let's try to do a behavior which is more in line with what we actually want to do as human beings. The goal of our life is not to spend, a tenth of our waking lives at following ads, right? So how do we do that? Well, you say, for instance, let's say you're on a video game. Today, right now, most of the video games are optimized for dopamine-mediated, anger, violence, competition, and so on. With the new technology, with AR and just the immersiveness of the new technology, there's no excuse to have to go down to that level of activation. Secondly, the feedback about what's going on in the user's brain has been absent up until now. So you have a shoot 'em game or something, and the user's just going down some crazy like anger thing or whatever it is, and the machine doesn't know. Machine's just saying level 1, level 2, level 3. But in the future, in the near future, those cameras and sensors and the equivalent of what the social media people get from their users, you can get from gamers. To know what's actually going on. Are they in fact aroused, and how long have they aroused? Are they in fact looking at the screen in a dazed-like way? Are they screaming over the mic to their pals? Are they have they moved much, or are they still sitting in the same position they've been in for 45 minutes? Right? These are signals that are now available, and so we can transform it from being a manipulate the behavior for one purpose, which is to optimize the machine's goal, to change into a control loop where the goal is to manipulate the human behavior for its own benefit. So okay, for instance, let's make a classifier that distinguishes between pro-social behavior and antisocial behavior in a simulated environment. It's not trivial to make those, but it's doable. And if you do make one of those, then you can have the same optimization technology used to get people to stay online and click to optimize things, cues, incentives, and so on that cause them to do this pro-social behavior.
But that feels in part like a technological solution to a technological problem. I mean, at the end of the day, what's going to motivate anybody to design something to stop people from being pro-social? If they found out that, when someone is feeling in a certain state of tiredness, they're more likely to click on an ad and buy something, then surely that's going to be the motivating factor that drives the design decision in that case.
Well, if you think about it, these are the same reasons. What's going to motivate someone to build a toxic chemical that pollutes the water supply or that destroys the climate? What's going to motivate them and what's going to stop them from doing it? Well, just think it's not going to be like profit motive by itself, right? It'll have to be profit motive sitting in some kind of double or triple bottom line environment where we're evaluating more than just a single goal, and we're evaluating human welfare in the optimization function. And that can be done, but it won't be done it won't automatically happen. It has to happen from a societal or governmental or some kind of self-regulatory environment. Now, I don't think that's that crazy. I don't think I'm that crazy left-wing radical. I think it's something, double bottom line has been around in the business community for years. The stakeholders group of the top 200 corporations in the world have agreed that there are stakeholders beyond shareholders, that shareholders are not the only important one. So this is just a conversation that we can start to have now in 2021. We have in the U.S. at least, we have a different possibility to have governance, and we have a world in which corporations are now at the same par of influence as governments, and so they are seeing that they have a responsibility to the entire world, an ethical and a sort of a stakeholder relationship with the world. That human behavior is not just a thing to extract value out of.
I mean, I know you work with the Center for Humane Technology, who have just become famous because of the Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma. And I just wonder, what is some of the work you're doing with them right now, which is trying to help build that better social relationship with technology?
Yeah, this is Tristan Harris and Company. It's a fabulous organization. I recommend people go. And of course, see the movie, Social Dilemma. Fantastic. Their basic tactic is to work within industry to try to influence from within, and then to give expert advice to government. And so if you think about it, a lot of the move, you maybe haven't read about the sort of more subtle things, but they're really working hard to make it so that employees who are considering where to use their very valuable talents as engineers or designers get to tell their employers, I don't want to work for a company that does this kind of thing or that kind of thing. I want to work on an optimization function that is more than just staying online. I want to work on an optimization function for human welfare. So if you start introducing these concepts at the grassroots of at the place where it's generated, that is engineers, designers, and managers, and so on. That's one of the tactics that they're doing, which is I really think is great. I think the other thing is the awareness thing. I mean, the movie was great, but there's a lot more to the story. I mean, a lot of people don't realize that just the sheer scale. I mean, you think about it, and Tristan has this great quote, which I love to retell, which is, there are more people addicted to Facebook and more people addicted to YouTube than people who are in the organized religions of the world, the top two, Catholicism and Hindu, and and those organizations only have you pray a few times a day, right? Not hundreds of times a day, and so this is a thing that just sheer awareness has to happen. We have to realize that this happened in front of us. Oh, by the way, it happened in like 5 years. In like 5 years, when social went mobile, the suicide rate for teen girls went up 70%. Okay, the amount of serious depression that's involved that would be kind of leading to suicide, to serious depression, went up equal amounts. So I mean, this is not a coincidence. This happened because all of a sudden now we have a wearable computer that's in our inner loops of our lives every day, with no brakes on it, manipulated by the most powerful AI that's ever been invented to control human behavior. And there's just no stopping the machine. So that's what they're trying to do, is stop that, create some awareness.
I mean, the question is, they've created this awareness, but are they actually doing enough? Because I see so much active work by underfunded organizations and privacy advocates who've been holding big tech accountable for years, but they didn't have that voice or a Netflix platform, or they didn't previously work at Google, so they've constantly been ignored. And is there a way in which the Center for Humane Technology can help give the smaller organizations who've been nipping at the heels of big tech for so long now, give them access to that microphone that they've been able to build?
Well, I think they're all on the same side of civil society, Center for Humane Tech, and the other organizations, ACLU, and all these other people who care about privacy and so on. I think the difference is really not about CHT, it's about the government. We had a government for 4 years in which science was dismissed, facts were dismissed, truth was dismissed. It was basically power for power's sake, right? And in that environment, you actually can't have effective government. It doesn't work. And so that era is over. We're back to government again. It's not, you can have your politics all you want, but we have a government now. We don't have a guy who's trying to take over. And so with that new model, there are going to be more people who are in the mid-career or late career who have tech backgrounds, who are willing to step up and maybe go to Washington and either influence or work in policy. I think that's going to be a big change. And I think CHT can have a big impact on helping to recruit and organize that kind of activity. And the other piece of it is there's also the partnership of AI to help benefit society, people in society. It's called partnershipforai.org. And they were formed as an explicit industry collaboration with civil society. So it's 50-50 industry, like in the big six corporations that do AI, Amazon, Google, Apple, and so on. And then a bunch of open, like I say, ACLU, and these people you're talking about who want to have a voice in the conversation. This organization is giving them a voice and making recommendations in a sort of a systemic think tank way, so that again, both industry can look at that and make a decision. I mean, if you notice, like I can't say, I don't talk to Tim Cook. I don't know what he's thinking or why he's doing it. But I've been reading the news like you, and they're making things that like, hey, Facebook, you don't get to do that anymore. We're drawing a line here. This is it. We're not letting you do that anymore. Or hey, hate speech person, we're not going to let you do that anymore. Facebook is saying that to some of the hate speech. I mean, these lines are being drawn. And if society goes, yay Apple, yay Facebook, or whatever for doing those things, then the companies can now realize that they get to do these things. It's okay.
It does feel like the consumer is driving a lot of this conversation. And the consumer doesn't sometimes realize how much power they do have to drive big tech organizations to change the way they're doing things. And you're right, the Apple story that's occurring right now and the way in which they're putting a little bit of pressure on Facebook is absolutely fascinating. It could actually be driven from the top down. But I do worry that what all of that sort of leans towards is a self-regulatory model, which I know we've seen work to the detriment of humanity when it comes to self-regulated finance. It does feel like Tristan and Co., because they're a little bit too heavily connected with Silicon Valley, that they've got friends with skin in the game. There's members of the CHT who have tech stocks. You know, it really works against them if they were to put pressure on some of these companies. So, you know, does it feel like we're moving towards a self-regulatory model there?
Well, two points. The people in CHT who are tech people are absolutely full all in on getting them to change their behavior. There's no conflict of interest there. Yeah. Like people like Roger McNamee, who has tons of stock in Facebook. Well, he's writing books, running around telling people that stock is dangerous. But so
why,
I mean, it's not like
why doesn't McNamee just divest in Facebook then? I mean, wouldn't that
I
be
don't know if he still owns any stock.
Right.
If I were him, I would divest it by now. But you know, I mean, but the thing is. Look, the bigger picture is, you know, can government, can industry self-regulate? Well, it's subtle. There's all kinds of like lobbyist talking points around this issue. But if you think about what's happening in energy, the energy markets, the futures markets for energy, and the investment community that would say decide whether a power plant is being created or not and what kind. Those markets are extremely strongly motivated they're investing in sustainable non-climate changing technologies and approaches. They're not doing it because they're nice people. They're doing it because they have an expectation that society will demand this, but they do have a long-term goal. They are specialists at long-term planning. They're basically investing money for 10 or 20 years. So if you have a long-term brain and you think, well, what is society going to think long-term, then you're going to be influenced by that. So I think that's going to happen with social media, where they realize that this nightmare happened overnight. They could be displaced or severely weakened by either a regulatory thing or just a backlash. And so, if they're smart and thinking a little bit longer than the quarterly earnings, then they can. They have their own incentives that are still enterprise, you know, for the good of the corporation, but a little bit more than one quarter.
It does feel like legacy thinking is the thing that may actually save humanity when it comes to the relationship between us and big tech. But I want to return to a little bit more about AI and a problem that you've been thinking about for a long time, which is the issue of natural language processing. And as you mentioned there, sometimes it's easier to get humans to think in machinic ways than it is for machines to understand human beings. And then there is that interesting tension there. But when and how, I guess, did you first get interested in the challenge that is natural language processing?
Well, I've been involved in natural language a lot of my career. I've always liked the idea that language is as an interface. And my first AI project was actually language as an output, which is an early version of this human assisted technology to help people speak who can't speak. So we could hook people to a computer and they could do what they can do with their motor control, and then it would generate speech for them, like Stephen Hawking type people. But also just in terms of interface, humans on the input side can use language better than other modalities. So I'm really mostly motivated by the fact that language is easy for humans to do. Now, we've also turned a corner in just the last few years where language is now language as the representation of knowledge is becoming understandable by computers. So there's technology now that pretty much you could read every single line in every single document in every single company's archives and have technology extract the facts, not retrieve the documents, but extract the meaning of the sentences as facts. Now, it's not understanding the nuance of poetry. It's not generating great dialogue that makes people laugh. But it's understanding facts. That's a huge thing. So now language is not only an interface, but it's a medium that computers can share in. So that's super exciting to me. And that's been through all along. We started out in the early days. Tom Malone is a professor at MIT who was influenced me early on in something he called semi-structured knowledge. which is basically you have like email, for instance. The structured part is like the address. The computers have an unambiguous, clear understanding what that means. But the unstructured part is, what does the subject line mean, right? And so this technologies of structured and unstructured have been moving throughout the decades. And now we're getting to the point where the unstructured piece is understood by the machines almost as well as the structured piece. And that changes everything.
Well, for anybody who might not know, how does natural language processing actually work? And what is the importance of neural nets in making it work?
Well, so there's speech in natural language, and then there's other things. So if you think about the speech coming in, when Alexa, Siri, when they hear the sound, and then they generate the text that you see, that's speech to text or speech recognition. And that's completely driven by neural nets that know nothing other than the data that's been given to them. But now they're getting enough data. There's enough examples of people saying enough words in enough orders so that the machines can sort of smooth over all those examples and make a generalization that can get to close to human abilities to do speech recognition. Now, humans aren't perfect at speech recognition, by the way. They're like, 90%, 95% good at it. Because you ever hear something, what was that? I didn't hear that. That's an error in a sense. But the way we get around it is because we do natural language understanding. Natural language understanding is taking the word sequences and making sense of them. Knowing that sentence meant, man bites dog, what does that mean? It means there was a human agent called, in other words, it's not just a bag of words. Now, that has been a problem for a long time, and neural nets are now, particularly transformers, are changing the way that we understand that text. Again, it's driven because we have this ridiculous amount of text data on the web as training examples, and we have essentially deep-pocketed research places like Google and OpenAI and so on, who are investing, basically keeping NVIDIA happy by investing in gobs and gobs and gobs of GPUs, which are these supercomputers on a chip that can do math. And all these things do is run all day long, making these ridiculously large generalizations over everything that's ever been written on the web. Is that the same thing as language understanding? Maybe that's not the question you asked, but it's an interesting question. I don't know. Maybe we can talk about it. But it looks like it is to many people. Like, in other words, it is so good at understanding what sequences of words appear in all the written examples it's ever seen that it's hard to know the difference between what it can do and what a lot of people do when they're looking at natural language.
I mean, I guess the challenge that we have today, right now, is the idea of context. It's so difficult to not just ask an AI for something or ask an intelligent assistant for something, but to have a true conversation with it so it understands sort of what your thought process is as you're asking the sorts of questions that you're asking. So how do you think we solve the context issue that we seem to have?
Well, I love that you bring out context. Context is super important. And context is basically everything that you need to know other than what was literally said to make sense of what was said, right?
It's like, why are you asking me that question?
Why asking me the question, exactly? Or why that tone of voice? Or like, what does it mean? What did we previously say to each other? If you say something, if I dropped some term of trade, like GPU, I just said a second ago, well, I mean, you probably know what it is. Maybe for other people I'm talking to, I have to say, for my mom, for instance, I'd say, well, it's just a very expensive small computer, whatever. But the point is that that's context. And we naturally use context every day when we understand language. So, but it's not magic. It's just science and engineering and data. So as we get more data examples, like for instance, the neural nets are now understanding long context as opposed to short context. It used to be that you get little blurts of 4 or 5 words in a row. That's what it would understand. But now these machines can kind of keep a bigger gulp in their head at one time and understand long context. They're still doing it in kind of an idiot savant way. These neural nets are still just basically doing matrix math on a giant amount of data, but it's appearing to approximate linguistics. See, it could be, if you get high enough into this question of, does it really understand? You're getting back to these basic philosophy problems of AI, right? Is it just is it people imitating, or is there such a thing as intelligence other than projection or other than imitation? These are hard questions, they're philosophical questions. But in the case of natural language, the operative thing would be give it a bunch of tests where there's no way it looks like anything. It just doesn't have any surface similarity at all to the meaning, and does it still understand? And there's a thing called a Winograd predicate or Winograd question that is trying to get at that. And the AIs are actually making progress on those kind of questions.
I mean, how close are we to an AI understanding sarcasm, for example? Because there used to be an old joke of if you wanted to mess with market research bots that were trawling through sentiment analysis on Twitter, all you have to do is be very, very sarcastic. Oh, I love Coca-Cola. Oh, I love Pepsi. You know, they don't understand that the tone under which that message was sent. Is there a way AI can potentially start understanding sarcasm?
That's nothing mystical. I mean, there's been dozens of PhDs in linguistics on sarcasm, on every kind of linguistic thing. It's just a matter of, is there data that represents it? What is the phenomenon? Can you find it? It isn't that hard. I mean, the tricky thing would be, back to your point about context. In general, would you know that I'm being sarcastic because you would predict that any agent of my sort with my background would make certain inferences, make certain assumptions? That's a context question. And so if you have two robots that meet each other, and one has wheels and one has legs, and they could make assumptions about the other person's, point of view in the world, that would look so they would misunderstand the language as sarcasm, just because they have different life experiences and different body plans. So there isn't really a linguistic answer to this in general.
Well, and let's talk about it in the context, I guess, of Siri and Alexa, and maybe some of the science fiction versions of intelligent assistants such as HAL. There are fundamental differences there, aren't there? There's similarities between those things, but also there's fundamental differences with how folks are thinking about intelligent assistants at the design level. And equally, there's vast amount of difference in how you're thinking about it from a design perspective at Sherpa.ai. So in what way, I guess, is Sherpa AI fundamentally different from Siri?
Oh, well, Sherpa is one of the companies I'm advising, and they are a white label version of Siri, Alexa, and so on. They're a white label assistant. And so that's interesting. It's just that the industry has moved to a point where it's not just platforms. You can actually make custom ones for cars or for headsets or for particular websites or whatever. Now that's but there's nothing fundamentally different in character between Sherpa and the major AI assistants, other than it happens to be better at certain things like personalization. But the main thing is that the whole class of virtual assistants today are kind of in a state. Right? I mean, obviously, at the beginning, Siri, and very quickly after, Alexa and Google Assistant came in with this current set of expectations that it should be able to understand basically utterances that are mostly either questions to ask a knowledge source or things to do, tasks, and it can get those. It doesn't have a dialogue much. It doesn't have much of a conversational sense. And it doesn't do anything like, tell me a joke. It doesn't make a joke up. It just has answers, right? The next phase will be to, in fact, get a bit more of agency in there. So today they're basically assistant as interface, and tomorrow they'll be assistant as agent, which is more like Hal, or my favorite Her, like the Samantha character in Her, where it's actually a social being. Now, the funny thing is we have idiot savant social beings today. We have Chow Ice in China. We have a million stupid little chatbots that are, some of them made by Russians, some of them made by hackers, whatever. They're all pretending to be human. And they're succeeding not because they're good AI, but because humans just can't stop. They can't help themselves of projecting agency into conversational agents. But anyway, but they don't pass Turing tests and everything because they aren't agency. And so now, but it doesn't take magic to create agency. Real AI researchers who didn't use neural nets have been working on this for decades and decades and making progress. But it's not going to, I don't think it's going to happen because we just have bigger, more GPUs. I think it's going to happen because we understand the psychology and the sort of social linguistics of social interaction. And I do think we're going to get there faster now than we ever did before because we have online data. We have a lot of examples of social behavior right now that are machine readable, and we never had that before. And from that, we can make better theories, and with the theories, we can make machines that do the theories.
And what about putting humans in the loop? The frustration I have with things like Alexa is if I ask a question or ask something of it that it can't deliver, it never hands me over to a human. The wonderful thing about the problematic thing about the telephone robots is at least eventually you can get through to a human if you want to. Should there perhaps be a human in the loop? Should that be an important part of the design process when something new or original is asked by a human being of an intelligent agent, that it hands that question over to a human individual to fill in the gap? Or is that sort of design already occurring out in the world?
Well, that idea's been around for a while. There's a guy named Ackerman that down at UC Irvine had this idea called Answer Garden early on, which is kind of like an early version of Quora, where you'd ask a question of the web, and if it could search and get an answer, it would give you the answer. If it didn't have an answer, it would place the answer in the garden, and then some expert would come around and answer it. And it's a self-organizing knowledge base of questions and answers. You could imagine, but that's a slow-moving one. But you can imagine the same principle being applied to things you ask assistants to do. Now I could ask Siri all day long to take my dry clean to the cleaners, and it's never going to be able to do that. But it could probably, if you hooked it up to the kind of web services that my colleague Adam Chire envisioned, there's no reason why you couldn't have a web interface to all the dry cleaners in the world that have online presences, and have them say, this is what we do the dry cleaning thing. And the assistant go, I don't know what you mean by today, let me check on that. And then it can go, oh, wait a minute, here's some services that do dry cleaning. Okay. And so that kind of learning loop is a system level learning. It's like the Answer Garden, where the collective gets smarter as the consumers, in this case, the person who needs dry cleaning, and the producer, the dry cleaning service, find each other. Right, and I think assistants have a ton of opportunities to grow in that realm right now, and there's even a way to do it economically. Obviously, you can imagine how you could see how a pay-to-click kind of thing is a good way to get through to that. I don't know of examples. I can't sit here and say I don't have a company doing that or anything, but it's kind of an obvious move. We're going to get there.
Well, this is, again, one of the perceived problems of what may happen with intelligent assistants, especially where they're designed by a particular stack. With Amazon and Amazon Alexa, for example, if you ask Amazon to purchase a product for you, it's not going to go to the multitude of possible places where a product can be purchased. It's going to go directly to Amazon. And equally, if I was to ask an intelligent assistant on my phone to order a taxi cab for me, it's going to be confused as to whether to go to Uber or Lyft or the multitude of possible platforms that there are. So how do we get over that interoperability problem and truly decentralize these things to allow them to make the best decisions for the end user human, and not have them tied to the biases of the platform through which they were designed?
Well, I see what you're saying there. I mean, you think about it, the answers that economists give to that question is things like free markets, right? So it's a decentralized way in which buyers find sellers and so on. Amazon would claim that it's creating a marketplace. So it's not just a biased seller. It's a set of them. They're, of course, operating under, in a walled garden. The assistant's job really can't be to, an assistant, no matter how smart it is with language or whatever, isn't going to be able to orchestrate a thing like a marketplace. But back to this idea that you could surface your capabilities and have them be unknown to an assistant. So like if the person who's the Uber, for instance, if there's an API that says, which there is now, the major assistants have this, but an API that says, I do ride sharing, and here's how I characterize my ride-sharing service. Here's the way that pricing works and availability and all that. And if that's a standardized thing, then an assistant can then say, well, you can have your Uber or Lyft or whatever flavor you want, because I'm talking to you in English and I'm translating that into a standard schema, basically, that we can be handed off to the back end. This is an age-old problem. I used to do this work on ontology, which is at the core of this problem. How do you have machines? How do you have a language that a machine can standardize on about the meaning of things, right? And the moment you have that meaning representation, then you can have multiple providers of a service on a level playing field.
And I wonder whether there needs to be an intermediary almost. You mentioned very briefly the idea of us putting all of our digital detritus out into the world that then can be repurposed so that we can have perfect recall. And some AI can go through all our social media posts and all of the podcast interactions that I've had and basically give me instant recall of something that you and I may have spoken about. And does the intelligent assistant necessarily need to talk to the human? Could it just talk to that digital avatar version of me? And it reminds me of Greg Egan's short story about the idea of having a little chip in your brain that learns everything about you just nascently. I think the short story is called Learning to Be Me. And then that's the thing eventually that replaces the human brain. That's kind of the joke in that short story. But by creating digital versions of us, which I guess already kind of exists with social media profiles and the ways in which algorithms on those platforms are interacting with our quote unquote digital selves. I mean, taking some form of ownership of a digital version of us and allowing that to make certain decisions on our behalf, something that knows our preferences purely by ambiently studying how we interact with digital platforms and digital technology. Surely that might be the thing that helps to deal with the translation issue.
Absolutely. That data doesn't have to live in an assistant's brain. There's one school of thought that says it should be something you can carry around. You carry your medical record and your private data on your device. The other school of thought says you should keep it in server farms in Mountain View or Menlo Park. And so those are both ways of approaching it. There's hybrid versions of that, where you have a virtual cloud, which is your private cloud, but it's still in some data center somewhere, so on. So the data can live anywhere. The question is this a different kind of agent? I mean, it's your digital life. And then on top of the data, there's any kind of inferences you can do. So you mentioned things like preferences. Well, preference learning is a task. You can have, you're talking about Sherpa.ai. That's one of the things they're good at. You could say, learn your preferences for something. But Amazon's good at that. Netflix is good at that. These are things that you can have services that run. It doesn't have to be there's probably not one best preference learning algorithm. But as long as we have the data provenance is the key thing. If you don't own the data and can't control it, then you don't really have any say in how it's used. And if it's only being gathered and paid for by advertising, then it's going to be used for advertising. So, that's another place where we can see changes in the way we operate with AI. The other piece of it is that, AI itself is really just reflecting the quote wisdom of the data that's been put into it. Today's AI. It isn't. It mostly is just imitating at scale, lots and lots of examples of cats on videos or whatever the data is, right? And people saying "mom," and it's not. It's garbage in, garbage out, right? When it comes to personal preferences, we haven't really seen this exploited properly yet, where you curate what you want the AI to learn from. So, for instance, you can say with that personal memory example, that faux pas that you did at that party one time. You don't want to forget it because you maybe want to learn from it in certain contexts like psychotherapy or self-improvement or something. But you also don't want to advertise it and make it super easy to come to mind when you're in a situation where it might make you nervous or something, right? So you want to be able to tell the AI, I want you to optimize your feedback to me and your inferences around the goals of helping me be more effective in social situations, helping me remember things professionally, and so on. And then the AI is just an optimization engine. It will learn the optimal way of organizing the memory to serve those goals.
Well, it feels like all of that comes back down to a very human thing, which is trust. I mean, will we ever learn to trust AI to make those sorts of decisions on our behalf? The reason we're asking it very simplistic questions is we don't trust it to answer any more complicated questions.
Your trust is super important, Luke, and I think we need to step back a level and say we have, in the U.S. at least, about 40% of the U.S. voting population has lost its trust in what is true. It's lost its trust in evidence as a way of finding out what's true. I'm not trying to be polemic. I mean, we have an epistemological crisis. We've essentially said, our leaders, some of our leaders have said to the population, it doesn't matter what your teachers or lawyers or any priests or anything. It doesn't matter what anyone says who has an established credential based on evidence. It only matters what you want to believe and what the people around you are saying. Okay, that's the trust problem today. That trust problem was partially created because of misuse of AI by social media, right? So filter bubbles and so on. But it's also the fundamental answer of how you get a relationship with trust in AI. If I don't trust that the information steward for my digital data is on my side, I'm not going to trust the conclusions of AIs that are based on that data. And here's a good, interesting example. Early on in China, I read something that was really interesting, that they paid no attention to paid television advertising about consumer products, and they also believed in these rumors, or like that the Chinese market got all the stuff that was defective, that didn't get shipped over the West, and so on. And so there was a lot of returns in consumer products. And the marketing people didn't understand why their ads didn't make any effect. And the reason is they had been systematically lied to for their entire lives by authority figures. So a television ad sounds like that, looks like that. So they only believe anecdotal information from their peers, which also is full of rumor, right? And therefore misinformation. That's an analog for what's happening now on a political scene, right? So we need to just reestablish the fact that we have a real society with real notions of truth that aren't propaganda, and that we can build trust in government, trust in corporations, trust in your social organizations, and slowly rebuild that trust empire. And then the AI is just an amplifier on top of that.
But it feels on top of that, we need transparency then. We need to design with transparency and privacy at the core, and think about ownership. At the end of the day, if your digital, I keep using the word detritus, but I guess the digital output that you are ambiently placing into the world through social media posts or other activity using a mobile phone, we need to have ownership of some of that data. We need to know what's going where, and how do we put that at the core of thinking about the design of the sort of web that we really deserve as humanity? Is it a move towards things like decentralization, away from the centralization that we seem to have in the 21st century?
I don't have a clear opinion on whether it's decentralized or not. I think it's an interesting thing to think about. Decentralization may be a piece of it, but decentralization feels at first blush kind of like let's make it less easy to count, or to gather. I mean, which it's just not a problem. And computers are absolutely omniscient to be able to remember things and count things. It's not going to gather and remember and store. There's a zero friction anymore to any of that stuff. It's more about like, how do we curate that digital stream in a way that's benefit to us. I mean, here's a simple thing. If you say, well, why don't we make AI that gives us better feedback about our health, for instance? Well, who owns our health data? How do we get to it? Right now, there's all kinds of ways in which we're stopped from getting our own health data.
Yeah.
And it's not, but I mean, wouldn't you vote to have a really good health record of every single encounter with every health in your phone? Yeah, I mean, why not, right? But there's all kinds of reasons why that's difficult. Artificial human-made reasons, not technical reasons, right? On the other hand, I really wouldn't want my, if I had a psychiatrist, an interview with my psychiatrist on Facebook, right, or some other. There's a boundary there where I don't want any government help. Thanks very much on that one, And so we have to make these decisions on the kind of how you steward the data. That's the key to it. I know it's not like a broken record here, but actually, until you get that right, you can't do anything else. Let's say you solve that problem of stewardship, so that you could trust the data. You had a relationship with either a company or a piece of hardware or something that said, I trust this boundary, that my personal data, I can afford to let it see me. Okay. Now let's talk about what you could do with that. Right. Well, we both have cameras pointed at our eyes right now. All the cameras on every cell phone we have that's modern today has the resolution and frame rate necessary to look at your pupils and to know look at how they're dilating, for instance, to look at your blood in your skin and your heart rate, to know your heart rate variability, to know whether if you do it every single day, and whether you're getting a fever. To even get things like there's some evidence you can do this blood pressure as well, other things like that. You can certainly also get, if you got a really good camera, you can actually look at micro variability in the pupils and see things that are relevant to basically your emotional state deep inside your limbic system. Okay, there's a ton of things that are there. There's also the fact, and there's also the fact that just by looking at the strokes, how you swipe on your phone, and how you use a keyboard. Can actually predict with high reliability whether you're going to have a psychotic episode or not if you're under care for severe mental illness. So the potential of this data is enormous to help us see ourselves better. Now, what we could do is we could say, let's create an AI program or a series of AI programs whose goal is only to help us be better. And I call that Big Mother instead of Big Brother.
Yeah.
And so a Big Mother, AI, is a thing that's job is to nurture and help you learn and be a better human being. And that's not happy talk. That's the job of it, as opposed to keeping me addicted to clicking and worrying, right? And you can gather data on that task. You can build models that optimize for those tasks. You can have scientific theory about what works and doesn't work. And all that can be accelerated now at a pace that we've never had before.
But the question then is does Mother have to be big in the big tech sense? I mean, can't it just be small? Can't we own this data, all of the data, especially when health and what you're talking about there? The idea that if I have full ownership over all of the health data that I'm either ambiently producing through wearable devices or other sorts of interventions that I've made. I can walk around with that data in a secure digital wallet, and I can start making decisions as to whether I want to share that with research groups, whether I want to share a little bit more with my doctor than with a drugs company or an insurance company, for example. I certainly don't want Big Mother to be Johnson & Johnson, the famous cradle to grave company. I don't want them to have full access to that information. Or if I choose to give them full access to the information, if they develop any drugs from that data, then I certainly would like my cut for contributing my small piece of information to that collective knowledge system. So are there ways we can all start to take ownership of the data that we produce to create these collective knowledge systems that together can help our intelligent assistants be smarter, and by virtue of that, the feedback loop allows us to be smarter and more virtuous too?
Yeah, there are. I mean, there's a fundamental trade-off or quandary here, is that to build a Big Mother model that optimizes for some, like given these signals, optimize human behavior this way. So get people to stop hurting themselves with chronic disease, for instance, doing behaviors that cause chronic disease or whatever it is, or addiction. So you can't build those on subjects, on clinical trials of size 1. You have to have population level data or at least population scale data, like thousands and thousands of data points over time to build the theories around how to solve those problems. But if you do that, of course, in a completely traditional old-fashioned way, you would basically have a vault of all the very personal data, and either you lock the vault up, like in HIPAA medical record thing, completely, or you try to like anonymize it a little bit in such a way that you can let researchers have access to it. It's sort of an unsolved problem in general, but there's a series of ways of doing it in AI. Basically, you could think of it as federated learning. It's a kind of distributed machine learning where you get the effect of a global model based on a population of data. Without the ability to do fishing experiments, to go into that global model and look up what Luke said on Tuesday. And that has been, it was first done in some experiments with TensorFlow and some of the big neural net machines, but also like the Sherpa company you mentioned, they're doing it for all kinds of all the other AI modeling techniques. And so you can have a little bit of your cake and eat it too. But what we haven't figured out yet, though, is this highly personalized learning thing. So let's say that I am a snowflake. Like the model that makes me tick is different than the one that makes you tick. So like, for instance, like say I have a problem with I'm eating too many potato chips and I'm getting heart disease or something like that. Well, maybe the tricks that work on me are different than you. And if that's the case, it's going to be hard to build a model unless you just watched me eat a lot of potato chips and die many times over. That's the way machine learning works today. You just can't
that's how it works today. It shows me pictures of people dying of eating potato chips and goes, "That's going to be you, buddy." It kind of inverses that relationship. So, but sorry, Tom, how do you think we can turn it back so it's personalized?
I don't think there's an easy way to do using traditional neural net and data-centric, data-driven statistical learning systems. They're data-driven, population data-driven things. Like I said, federated learning can help protect a little bit of anonymity. Mm-hmm. However, if, let's say, this is unproven and unfinished work, but let's say you have the idea of a dialogue with a user, with an agent, where you're essentially teaching the agent what you want to know, or what you want to be good at. Yeah. So memory is an easy example. Remember that fact. Of course, it remembered everything, but it's remembering that fact in particular, because then if you say something vague like, what was that thing I asked you to remember like last Tuesday? What was that thing with that guy with the blue background, or some other vague query like that, that it could probably get that right because you told it that was an important thing to remember. So on the needle in the haystack problem gets easier. Another way might be like, remind me that if I drink 3 bottles of wine, I'm not going to feel good the next day. But remind me when I'm about to drink the 3 bottles of wine, not the next day, right? Overcome my human ignorance or human limitation. You could train an AI to do those sorts of things without a population level model. You could just do it with your own personal AI. And it wouldn't be hard. We used to do that kind of machine learning in the 80s. It doesn't compete with statistical learning for like average performance over large sets of examples. But if in terms of small numbers of examples, you can do this. And so I think we might see the reemergence of this combination of sort of traditional symbolic AI with statistical AI when you get down to this n=1 study.
I mean, I guess the question is then, what is the point? We get to the old joke of, is Google making us stupid if we can just outsource bits of our memory to other agents, which I guess we've been doing throughout history by writing things down. Will it get to the point where we'll start expecting less of human beings and more of AI, and won't that really be a tragedy?
Oh, it's funny. People say it's like the calculator thing with kids. They can't multiply 3-digit numbers anymore. And listen, I stopped multiplying 3-digit numbers. I have a PhD. I don't care. I don't need it. It's not an important skill anymore. Remembering trivia or looking at the definitions of words. What Google and that sort of whole ilk of super low friction knowledge retrieval has done, as it's super augmented people like us. So now we can actually think about this. If you're at dinner and someone says a word that you hadn't heard before, or you think you're really curious about what it really means, the term really means, you can get an answer in 5 seconds now. And then you can contribute that answer to the conversation and go on and say something more intelligent, or move on to a new conclusion. In the past, it would be go to a friggin' library. I mean, it would never happen, right? So I think that kind of augmentation totally strengthens you. And it even, not even just on the level of like social discourse. I mean, the basic idea that you have reduced the friction for being able to retrieve things from memory it means that you can actually exercise your memory retrieval more often, which the science and psychology says is how you learn. So, for example, if I encoded a memory one way, episodic memory one way, and then I had a visual in my mind of that memory, maybe I'm a visual retriever. But then later on, I'm in the car and go, wait a minute, what about that thing, with that scene with the dog or whatever it is? I'm using an auditory or an object-centered way of retrieving it. I don't have a good memory of that, but the machine could bring it back. Show me the picture of the thing with the dog, and I'll go, yeah, that was it. I mean, here's actually the real example I'm thinking of is Mary Lou Jepsen is this fascinating engineer and inventor. She's inventing this near-infrared imaging things that shines red light into your brain and can do all kinds of cool things. Well, she gave a TED Talk in which she held up a piece of chicken and shined a red light through it. Now, you can't unsee that. I mean, that's a great prop, right? But now people go, who's that chicken lady? That TED chicken lady scientist, and then, but because you bothered to do the retrieval, all of that episodic memory comes back with it, and that strengthens the neural connections to the memory in a way that makes it easier for you to remember that her name is Mary Lou Jepsen the next time. And so it's a great example of augmentation makes you stronger.
But can't we do that anyway? As just using the biology of being human. I mean, and I best remember things when I walk. I mean, there's parts of New York that I can walk through where I can recall conversations that I've had with people on the phone at that street corner. And the only way I can have a meaningful conversation is to be on the move. And partly that's because of COVID-19. I'm always sitting in the same location. Everything begins to feel samely. I mean, there's so many things we can do as human beings that don't require outsourcing memory to technology. And shouldn't we strengthen those things through mindfulness practices, perhaps, instead of just assuming that this stuff doesn't matter anymore? I guess what I'm trying to get at is, one, how I would feel if Tom, you took out your phone in the middle of a conversation that we were having over dinner to Google something, and how I would feel about that. And secondly, when you forget about how to multiply, what do we actually fill that space with? Are we filling it with stuff which is useful to us, or are we just filling it with more detritus, digital detritus, and more clicking and more buying? And how do we make informed decisions about how to use our limited human brain power? Because that's to me feels like the thing that will truly make us superhuman, by making the right sorts of decisions about what to interact with in our daily lives, as opposed to having a brain that allows us to interact with so much in our daily lives. It's not about quantity, it's about quality at the end of the day.
Well, there's a really good example of this. I wish I could give credit to the author I read this from.
If only you had the AI that would allow you to recall.
Ironically, isn't it? But the example was Jimmy Carter. So Jimmy Carter was a thoughtful, PhD nuclear scientist, thoughtful man. He does meditation, does he's a grounded guy and all this kind of stuff. He has a personal assistant, of course. And so people, the anecdote was, when people come to visit Jimmy Carter, they go into the room with him, and he made them feel like he had basically all of his attention was just on them and nobody else. His assistant would come in and pull him out if his schedule demanded that he leave the meeting, or if there was a high priority interrupt. Or he could just say, don't forget that, make it take an action or whatever to the assistant. The assistant was basically augmenting him so he could be more present. Okay. And that enhanced the human experience. I think there's an effect like that. The whole hierarchy of needs thing, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, there's some equivalent to that in cognition, which no one's given a name to yet that I've seen. But that idea that you can do the higher things if you can offload some of the drudgery of the lower things. I mean, you think about it, there are people who are especially I see it in programming, in software engineering, there's a certain kind of brain that's of a really good software developer. They can keep enormous amounts of registers active in their head, just tons of short-term memory, ridiculous amounts. And you go but they can apply that to regular life, and they'll remember all this stuff. And he's like, well, why do you bother remembering all that stuff in your head, right? And if they don't bother, it's just easy for them, okay? But as they get older, it's going to be less easy. But that's not the potential of the human brain. I mean, by the time they get old, I hope the programming is being done for them. Programming is a tedious, horrible little task. Why would you want to keep doing it all the time, right? But conversation never gets old, as it were, especially good ones like with you. And so I would think that that's what we want to optimize our tech to help us do, to free us up to do this sort of thing.
I do wonder whether the rise of podcasting is actually going to help inform intelligent agents. I'm sure somewhere someone's trying to trawl through all of Joe Rogan's backlog to teach an AI how to understand comedy and how to understand sarcasm. And with that kind of science fictional view, I do feel like I have to ask, before we finish, how science fiction has informed your work. If you've ever seen any really good examples of humanistic AI being represented in science fiction, and what we can learn from that.
Oh, I mean, amazing amounts of, all the way, Snow Crash and the David Brin books. Well, the Brin books were predicting the web and the idea of a global Gaian brain way before it happened. Snow Crash, and then a bunch of the Diamond Age, a bunch of these companies' books, these books are so prescient. Even Asimov, with his 3 laws of robotics, was already getting at the ethics of AI early on. And as you know, some of your people you've talked to dealt into that example. They basically, he made a literary device out of this interesting philosophic problem that we are now living with. Do the AI that drives Facebook's platform to allow Myanmar's dictators to kill people, Is that self-harm? And should the AI have prevented it? And then if the AI can't prevent it, should we turn off the AI? This is the ethical questions we're talking about right now, right? So science fiction authors have been great at this sort of thing. And I actually use them for inspiration all the time. I mean, even crazy guys like Charles Strom, who had this, I think it was called Accelerando, where there's different parts of space where the physics of that part of the universe allows automation to work better or worse, so that it turns out if you're in the automation-friendly part of the universe, you can have deep fakes that are indistinguishable from real humans. So that if you want to have an authentic conversation, you have to fly over to the part where only teacups, cups and strings work, low-tech area, but you can trust your communications. Isn't that great? Because that's happening today, right? Do we allow ourselves to interact on a digital media in which anonymity is the norm and everything just works well, or do we put in some friction, and make it more like a human experience?
Well, Tom, let me allow you to do a little bit of Charlie Stross style future gazing here. Where do you think humanistic AI will ultimately get us as a species? What do you think is the true future rollout of this? What's your most hopeful vision for humanistic AI?
Well, I think that's easy. I think there's the principle is optimize for human benefit in your optimization function, what I call the objective function. I think as we understand that almost all AIs are driven by optimization or objective function inside somewhere, reduce errors against classification, whatever it is, there's an objective function. And as we recognize that those functions, which are machine understandable, embody essentially human values right now. So if an advertising machine says, I only optimize for time on site, then you're going to get behavior control that's optimized for that. But if you say, optimize for time on site and pro-social interaction and self-care behaviors and so on, and you can measure those things and bubble the results of those up, we can start having a rational society where we say, look, it's not about us versus them regulating bad companies to do good things. It's like, let's agree on what we want to achieve in society. And then let's orient and align the technology we're using to help us behave that achieves those goals. And I think that's completely doable as long as we have we don't lose our freedoms.
Well, with that small caveat, Tom. Oh God. I just want to thank you for your insights today, and on that note, Tom Gruber, thank you for your time today.
Thanks very much. It's been fun.
Thank you to Tom for his thoughts on how to design more humanistic AI. If you like what you've heard, then you can subscribe for our latest episode. Or follow us on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram @Futures Podcast. More episodes, transcripts, and show notes can be found at futurespodcast.net. Thank you for listening to the Futures Podcast.